This is part two of a two-part discussion that I had with Tom from Rhizome House, which is an info shop in Cleveland, Ohio. In the first part, we had introductions, talked about Cooper Harris Andrews, who worked with Rhizome House prior to traveling to Ukraine. Cooper fought on the Ukrainian side of the conflict in an act of international solidarity against Russian imperialism. We talked about Tamir Rice and some history of social movements in Cleveland. This video begins at a point in which campism, alternative media, and anti-imperialism were being discussed. We covered a lot in part two, and I might end up making a whole other video or article summarizing some of the key points, but we'll see. Remember to check the description for links and to like and subscribe to help visibility. All right, here's part two of Tom from the Rhizome House.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, the United States is unique in being an imperial force that it's existed for a while, and this is particularly unique probably because Russia was the counterpoint to that. Yes. And so when you're talking about very basic, not analysis, but maybe self-awareness about what's going on with the United States and how everything in the United States is imperfect, a lot of the Red Scare and overexuberance and propaganda from the United States government probably informed these folks, to some degree, to say, oh yeah, well, of course you think Russia's evil, and I don't know, but I do wonder, especially for folks who are a little bit older than us, but younger people too, how that plays into specifically Ukraine as opposed to, and even Syria, because Russia was engaged there, as opposed to something that was more black and white, like the United States invading Iraq, and there's a clear duality to that and what was happening.
Yeah, I think this is where outlets like Gray Zone and Russia Today become incredibly important, because people can say, I'm not mimicking government propaganda, I'm talking about alternative media. Except the alternative media is the same position as government propaganda, right? So like, what happened in that situation, and what the Russian state very specifically does incredibly well, we also see this in the American far right, is they are incredibly capable of turning terms completely on their head. Right. So now alternative media is generated by a state, just not the one that it's broadcasting.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's not that it's citizen media, like a project like Indie Media was in the late 90s, early 2000s, where like people would actually form collectives and report on what was going on in their cities, or even something like Patch, which was after that. Right. Or even early social media where like, I got to watch the fall of the Egyptian government live on Al Jazeera's live blog, because like people were posting minute by minute updates down in the comments, right? Like, and it was the first time you could do that. And so we're sort of existing in this time, I think, where to come to terms with the complications of everything is to also come to terms with the idea that nobody has answers, right?
Yeah.
And that's scary. That's terrifying. But in a lot of ways, it's that jumping into the abyss that is our salvation, right?
That should be the exciting possibility,
Yeah. That should be the exciting possibility at the other side of the end of the world, right? And so instead of that, though, what we have is this rehashing of these simple normative frameworks,
right?
Like campism, right? So, outlets like Russia Today are incredibly effective because it allows people who don't consider themselves to be like bootlicking authoritarians to still mimic the exact same politics while still claiming that they got it from alternative media, right?
Yeah.
It is spectacularly effective, devastatingly so, because it is very thorough, and it is not about. So if you really watch that kind of media, it's not about articulating a position. It's about articulating the opposition to the other position. Yes. And it is entirely, completely, fundamentally reactionary and contradictory all the time. Yep. But that doesn't matter, right? You see this with the American far right. It doesn't matter whether Matt Gaetz contradicts himself one sentence to the next. What matters is that Matt Gaetz is saying the opposite of whatever liberal he's targeting in that comment said, right? That's it's all that matters.
Framing, narrative. Facts don't matter,
Yeah. And so what have we allowed ourselves to do when we embrace that framing? We've allowed states to dominate global politics. We've allowed them to be the only category that we think things through, and therefore a category that becomes essential to the entirety of how we understand our mobilization of conflict, right?
Yeah,
As
yeah,
well as part of global social movements, right?
yeah,
The state then becomes kind of irreducible.
yeah,
It becomes this sort of thing that always has to exist in some form or another. And that is, especially when we're talking about justifying authoritarianism, deeply disturbing. It really
yeah.
prevents us from being able to critique. You know, we were talking about earlier campism as being a way to excuse away Stalinism. But what are we watching excuse away now? Right?
Right. You
I mean,
become,
chemical gas attacks, all kinds of stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's, you become what it is that you think you're critiquing.
Yes.
If people are, if, like we're talking about possibilities of autonomous global solidarity and direct
Mm-hmm.
actions and things like that. Whereas maybe the other folks are talking, yeah, I mean, I look at like geopolitics, which I have no stake
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever, right?
Sure. Sure.
But you end up, and so the critique would be, well, yeah, you can say all this stuff about,
Mm-hmm.
solidarity and this and that, but all you're doing is advancing NATO's agenda, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And but
Yeah.
by saying that, I mean, one, you're dismissing the people involved, but
Yes.
also you're counteracting people that are actually attempting to do something as
Yeah.
opposed to
Well,
talk about it. But
and you're also
and
creating a conspiracist lens
a
in which
conspiracist
NATO or the
lens,
CIA becomes so completely powerful that it's absolutely pointless to resist. I mean,
which
this
is
is
like
kind
this
of
weird
the,
imperialist thing too.
you see
It's
that with
not
Alex
to be.
Jones, right?
Yeah,
You see that with Alex Jones too. He creates
yeah,
this global structure that's so powerful. What's the point in fighting it? You're just going to
yeah.
lose. And it creates a demobilizing effect.
Well,
Like it's really effective at doing that.
you're doing, and then bringing it full circle. You're arguing that folks over on this side are really just counteracting what should be done.
Yeah.
Where all of a sudden you just become an acolyte of another state.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you're I mean, essentially you're doing what they're bidding for free,
Yes,
right?
you are. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, there is the trope of the useful idiot, and I think that that's way too reductionistic. There are plenty of perfectly well-informed people that fall into this kind of a trap. But
yeah,
I think what is really fascinating about watching that narrative play out, specifically in relation to Syria and Ukraine, is
right,
the way that they were able to appropriate the categories of leftist anti-imperialism,
yeah,
right, to justify invading something. I mean,
right.
think about that for just a second. Like, step back for just a second and
That's
think about what
excellent.
happened. The
Yeah,
Russian government used anti-imperialist concepts to justify invading something based on information that they were the only ones that claimed was true, that there was no evidence of, a la the war in Iraq. And
yeah,
yet somehow people are supporting it. It is mind-boggling. But its explanation really comes in the way that media is incredibly astute,
yeah,
right? It is actually incredibly good at what it does. And what in Russia are called political technologists are potentially the best political strategists on earth. They're incredibly good at what they do, because what they do is not propaganda necessarily. What they do is reality construction. And that's a completely different thing, right? It is not about the individual point. It's about constructing an entire reality in which X, Y, or Z thing, which is overtly counterfactual, seems to make sense,
right.
right? And they're just really, really good at doing that. And campism is the linchpin in that entire strategy. It requires that dichotomous black and white separation for that narrative to function.
Right. And even, I mean, everything you said is accurate, and I'll be doing more on that concept in the future. And sometimes stuff gets like it'll get wordy for sure, but yeah, I think that bring it back down to earth. Yeah, I mean, if you're arguing on behalf of another government's right to invade a country, I mean, it's just on a very basic, like, just stop, and like, what are you doing, man? Like,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
you're not feeding people, you're not doing Narcan runs, you're not protesting anything. and, and
right.
and sometimes I think that reality, because especially social media, we talk about algorithms and dumbing
Mm-hmm,
things
mm-hmm,
down, and with that, but I do think sometimes people get caught in these abstractions, like you said, these
mm-hmm,
rhetorical
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
abstractions. When you step back and just say, look, stop. What are you saying? And what are you doing? Keep it very basic. It can present itself as what it is.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
And I think that this is one of the tragedies of the American left specifically is the ways that it tries to solve problems in the abstract. Yeah. So it says, we haven't succeeded. So therefore, what is wrong with the theory that we have about what? It's not about that. The problem is that you're trying to answer the question in theory, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to engaging in the space in which conflict is supposed to occur. That is why these ideas can take root in the traditional left, I think. Yeah. Is that the traditional left is based on its abstraction, right? Like it is grounded in grand notions of class warfare that are sort of ahistorical and cross over historical situation. The way that Marxists, a lot of them talk about conflict is to say that one mirrors exactly another. And so therefore we can do what we did. There's this ahistoricism to it that exists to the degree that something like political conflict becomes
pretty ironic,
an abstract object to talk about, right? Pretty ironic, right? And then that abstraction process is the quote science of revolution, when it's really just theology. You know, this is really where things like campism can take root, right? In that it is one position within many, within a reality that is constructed in these narratives, whether that narrative is like Chomsky and leftism, or you know, kind of American Maoism, or the far right. Those are whole universes. Like if you listen to these people talk, they sound like priests, right? Because what they are selling is religion. Fundamentally, they're selling a metaphysical system that can answer all of life's questions, right? And when we disrupt that, and I would argue that like kind of later contemporary anarchist politics is fundamentally grounded in disrupting that simplicity. When we disrupt that, the blowback is extreme, as we see online. Yeah. Right? Completely over the top. We're going to round you all up and kill you when we win the revolution, like that kind of stuff.
Right. Which is
grounded in abstraction. What does it really mean to execute 100,000 people? In a practical sense, what does that mean? And how are you going to control other families afterwards? I mean, like, these are like real questions that something like the Assad regime is trying to figure out how to anser right now. Right. Yeah, but they're not abstract.
I'm glad that you brought that back. Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's and that's a whole discussion, you know, because I think that there's abstraction built in. I think that some of it is living in the West and having that privilege of distance, as well as, you know, being just far away from these conflicts and who you are. I think that there are groups in the broader left, you know, in the United States that don't fall into these things, but also don't run in these circles because they're busy actually doing stuff.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
So, we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, but I mean, a lot of the work that someone like Cooper was involved in was sort of what locally we'd call kind of left adjacent or parallel to the left, right? Like it wasn't part of traditional leftist politics in the sense that it didn't use those norms or those categories necessarily, but really focused on things like local autonomy movements, which in Cleveland, if anyone wants to really read an interesting history, there's a book called Bullets or Ballots, which is about Black autonomy movements in the city of Cleveland, because Black nationalism looked very different here. And it was all hyper local, and it was all grounded in neighborhoods, and it was all about neighborhood autonomy, right? And so a lot of the political work happens on these microscopic invisible scales. That's the work that's meaningful, right? In that work, all of a sudden, things are very complicated, right? People are complicated. People are sexist and homophobic and racist and things like this. And the cops get in your way. And sometimes someone doesn't show up with a food delivery. Like there's all of these complications, right?
That's exactly what I was getting at. Yeah.
You know, and so you learn to exist in your space when your politics is grounded in that sort of an understanding, right? And someone like Cooper was really coming out of a community of people that was heavily grounded, not necessarily in like not doing things like protest, but not primarily doing things like that, primarily doing things like organizing events and doing things on a ground level. You know, the work that really matters. So like in a place like this is the second poorest city in America. If we spend our time debating abstract issues of radical politics, people die, literally.
Yeah.
They die of overdoses, they die of malnutrition, they die here.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. The imperative is there, and whether we're talking about, I mean, you know, harm reduction stuff or sexism or racism or policing actions, these discussions don't happen in those spaces, you know? They
Yes.
do happen when we're talking about global politics and war.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, it's because it's not happening here, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the dichotomy between talking to, we share some groups that we've talked to that are directly, engaged in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus,
Mhm.
and for them, the abstraction doesn't exist, and so they have a
Mhm.
different, they have the same take on it
Yeah.
as what you just stated. Someone, if you don't hand out Narcan, someone could overdose on fentanyl,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
or
It's
fentanyl
very
test strips or
real to
something.
them. Like
It's very
I've
real
had
because that's
videos
their
sent to
experience.
me from
Yeah,
my friends there where they're filming out of their apartment windows as Shahed drones are getting blown up
right.
by anti-aircraft fire right over their apartment building.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Like that's their life in Kyiv every day to the
right,
point where now people just take, a lot of people I know there take sleeping pills to just sleep through the air raid sirens because they've kind of become sort of fatalistic about it.
right.
It's like, if the engine from the drone that gets shot down is going to land in my apartment block, well, whatever, I'm not going to not sleep tonight to go to the subway.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
that reality, is not something
Right,
Americans can understand.
right. And I think that that's true. There's some of it where you can get into, debate about historical Marxism or liberal history and how that views global politics. But I do think some of it is just, well, like we talked, being socialized in an imperialist empire nation too, how that
Mm-hmm.
impacts how you
Mm-hmm.
view the world and other people in the world, even when you're trying to help them. But also it's just a reality, to where most people I don't think would be saying what they say about the conflict in Syria or Ukraine if they were talking about it in terms of having a potluck, or
Mm-hmm.
having
Mm-hmm.
harm reduction or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's that, I mean, it's kind of like that privilege, it's that, but
Mm-hmm.
and that seems to be a schism, that I've seen just talking
Yeah.
to people, that
Yes.
are actually living there. And especially when you get into, I mean, forget media, but when you get into academia as well,
Mm-hmm.
these things
Mm-hmm.
become
Mm-hmm.
what you were saying, they're so abstract,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not it's just fundamentally an issue. If you're talking about abstracting something like historical materialism, I don't know how you do that, but forget all that. Even just having been socialized and how you fundamentally view the world is
Yeah.
different. But you can find solidarity in that by just juxtaposing situations a bit,
Mm-hmm.
moving those
Mm-hmm.
shells around and saying, oh, okay, like I understand how this is different now. you
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone that you're going to work with on mutual aid runs, or if you're working on community action, like you said, for safety or self-policing, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be complicated
Yeah.
as hell,
Yeah.
right? But that's
Yeah.
how you do it, unless you want to rely on the police or NATO, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And so, when you talk to people over there, they're the categories they're using are very, very, very practical. It's like,
right,
we have to survive the war, then we'll go deal with the Nazis. Like,
right.
okay, fair enough. Like, that's a totally realistic thing to say. It is absurd for some to say, oh yeah, all the anarchists just should have left Ukraine and let everybody
Yeah,
die.
and it's what they
Right.
did in Syria too, and
Yeah. Yeah.
if,
And
if you
so
yeah, if you
I
flipped
have
it,
this.
and,
Yes.
and, and said, say Russia said this about the United States and Iraq, right?
Yes.
And if
Exactly.
that would fundamentally turn on its head. Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And I pretty routinely encourage people to say, word the things that are happening in the United States in the same way that they'd be worded if it was a news story that happened overseas.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you start to take like the forest fires, which are displacing thousands of people. That's a refugee crisis. I mean, like, when we
Yes.
really think about it, that's a refugee crisis, right? Like,
Right.
we don't talk about these things in those terms because there is this weird assumption in the United States that we're somehow separate from all of this.
Right.
Right. That, of course, it's not a refugee crisis, it's just people getting moved from a forest fire.
Right.
Right. We are unwilling to use those terms when we talk about ourselves.
Sure.
Right.
Failure of government, global warming. I mean, just all. Yeah. Global climate crisis, refugees flee. I mean, yeah, these are all things that you hear about, but it's in
Yeah.
Africa
Yeah.
or the Middle East. Yeah, for sure.
There's a fascinating article written in 2020. I forget the author's name. He's from was it Myanmar? Sri Lanka. He's from Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
And he's living in the States now. But the article was about what does political collapse look like? From someone who lived through it as in this case, middle-class person living in the capital, what does it look like to watch a political system implode?
Right.
And what he said was, well, it looks like you hear about a bombing going off over there, and you hear about the far right fighting someone over here, and you hear about the power going out over there, and a disaster over here, and exactly the same crap you hear about the news in the United States. Right? Like, what are we experiencing except that? And I think we have to understand people that fall into these weird conspiracist positions or authoritarian positions completely in that light, right? That we might not use that terminology to talk about it, but what we are experiencing is political system collapse, right? We're living in the middle of it. And I can tell you as a person from the Rust Belt, it gets worse, right? We've been experiencing it for a lot more years than a lot of other people have.
Yeah.
Our institutions are nice and fully delegitimized now. And so,
yeah.
You know, but what that means is like now we have to solve a lot of our own problems. And there is a lot of responsibility and freedom that comes with that. Right. But this is the sort of world that we have to understand. And that's not a world that is simplistic. That is a world that is deeply complicated, deeply grounded in its circumstance. And it's one that we have to understand, right? If we're going to be able to actually be effective in this kind of work. Whether that's internationalist resistance or, you know, mutual aid projects on your block.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of, you know, I'll be doing some stuff in the future about some of the things we talked about, but I want to bring it back because I think that all that discussion plus more kind of at least informs people of, all right, so there's this guy Cooper, right, Harris, who is from Cleveland, African American, went to Ukraine. Why did he do it? Right, what was he doing? And he died, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, media didn't in the West didn't talk about any of that. But he was engaged with the Rhizome House, which you are too, right? And you know, so let's talk about some. So that's the international stuff, and I've been kind of joking about, you know, people talking instead of doing stuff. So let's talk about the stuff that people do, you know, because that's what the Rhizome House is. And I looked at the website, and there's tons of stuff. You know, I'll let you discuss, but I mean, presentations, films, knitting circles, potlucks. There was just a tornado, I believe, in the area, and you all are helping with. So talk about the Rhizome House, because maybe this is an opportunity to get less abstract. And this is literally a beautiful stone brick building, that's doing stuff. So what's happening there?
Yeah. So, you know, I was talking about this bookstore, right? And as this bookstore that all of us met Cooper through was kind of falling apart, we started having some conversations about what went right, what went wrong, who we didn't want to work with anymore, who we did, so on, so on. And we started getting a collective together to start a space that very specifically was not going to sell books. Like we had decided we didn't want to run a bookstore anymore. We didn't want to print. Like we were going to run a social center in the kind of European model, right? So like, for those of you that don't know, like a social center, as opposed to like an info shop. So like in the US, we have info shops, right?
Yeah.
Info shops are kind of like anarchist bookstores. You go there, there's flyers, there's books, there's stuff like that. A social center is different in that it is like often an anarchist or autonomous run space, but is primarily engaged in either facilitating or doing political action, right? So you have, you know, addiction recovery groups meeting at your space. You pack Narcan kits for them. You know, have groups that go to other parts of the world, come back and do their report backs. You have conferences about hyper local organizing, like, and all of these things in between. So the Rhizome House as a project, you know, we went on, we were going to form and then the pandemic happened, right? And obviously opening up a place during the pandemic is not the right thing. So we actually became a mutual aid collective and made like thousands of bottles of hand sanitizer. A lot, like we were supplying community centers and stuff. But after the pandemic, we were allowed to open. And so the project comes out of two strains in Cleveland political history, which are really relevant here. The first, obviously, is the DIY scene, right? So like the Rhizome House draws its roots back to a space called Speak in Tongues, which was kind of like the punk venue in Cleveland for like underground punk shows, like in the late 90s, early 2000s-ish. That myself and a lot of other people went to some of our first shows at and stuff like that. And there's this direct continuity of spaces involving some of the same people that go all the way from there till now, like 25 years, which is pretty cool.
It is cool.
There's a lot of lessons learned in that period of time.
I mean, that's why I came out.
Yeah. And so that's one route. But the other route for the Rhizome House is what in Cleveland is called the community house movement. So the community house movement was, or they were called settlement houses. Some of them called them settlement. Yeah. But they were these mutual aid houses in the city of Cleveland that, I mean, they were the support structure for whole communities of people. A lot of them still exist. I mean, there are, like Merrick House in Cleveland, or the East End Community House. Like these were community houses that have existed for almost 100 years at this point, doing mutual aid work, right? And so that is this major cultural influence in the way that people in the city grow up, and like how we understand what our role in relation to our communities are and what we are to rely on if we run into hard times and things like this, right? And so the Rhizome House is very deeply embedded in that tradition too. So we sort of, by luck, found a space through some personal connections. And we were planning only on being open a couple days a week because, a little bit of a surprise. We got the place. We hadn't reconfigured our lives and stuff yet. And then we opened the place up, and now we're open like 5 days a week. Yeah, like almost every day at this point, we've got something going on. A lot of that stuff we're facilitating with other groups, right? So we work a lot with other organizations in town. That's in a lot of ways the community that helped start the Rhizome House. That's always been a little bit of our role in radical movements here, is that we often play kind of infrastructural roles. And so we know a lot of people, and a lot of those groups meet up at space. And so it's become this kind of nexus point, right? Like we refer to it as a space of encounter, right? So it's this place where most of the people that come are not members of like leftist organizations, right? They're people from neighborhoods. They're people who run community gardens. They live around the corner. They're somewhat, I mean, the number of like really awesome people that live in these like far-flung towns outside of the greater Cleveland area that don't have anywhere to go, that drive an hour to get to Rhizome House stuff, is astonishing. Like there's a lot of people that do that. And so it's become this kind of nexus point. But what's really cool, what I've really appreciated about it is it's part of a kind of movement in Ohio right now to start these kind of radical social center spaces. There's one in Youngstown that just opened up as well. And there's other groups around the state talking about it. And it's all based on this model of running a space within the confines of what you're capable of in your life, right? So we are not the project. Like the project is not our entirety of who we are as people. We live lives outside of this. And so rather than making our lives conform with the project, which is very unsustainable, we make the project conform with our lives, right? We do what we can with the money we've got. We do what we can with the time we've got and the resources we have. And the idea is to build very, very slowly. I mean, we talk about this project on like 10-year timelines, 20-year timelines. A lot of us are, I mean, it is an anarchist space. A lot of us identify with the insurrectionist tradition, but that doesn't mean that we're not patient. And so we've already been engaged in political struggle in the city for a decade, almost, since they murdered Tamir, pretty much nonstop. The Rhizome House, in a lot of ways, is an outgrowth of that, right? And those movements come directly out of the neighborhoods. Like those are not primarily traditional leftist movements. Those are coming directly out of the neighborhoods. So it's a different kind of organizing, right? It reflects, there was a project in Cleveland before the Rhizome House that was called Sleeper Service, and it was a newspaper, right? It was like a DIY community newspaper. And it had no online presence on purpose. No Facebook page, no Instagram, nothing. You could only get it, you could only get it in person. Yeah, you could only get it in person. And so what that meant is that for the people that were distributing it, they had to go places and drop it off, like coffee shops and stuff like that. They had to build relationships with people. The people that were picking it up needed to know where to go get it. So they had to be part of a community of people, meaning that if you were like someone who is prone to sexual assault or a snitch or something, people just didn't tell you when stuff was happening or where to get information, right? And you would just, that was a way for communities to keep themselves safe, right? But what it did was it created an in-person community of people that wasn't based on maximizing the number of people that show up, or based on like getting the most likes or follows online, but was really based on the robustness and resiliency of the connections that people were making together. And a lot of the projects in town today grew out of relationships like that. Right? They started off as friendships, then they started getting involved in projects. Before you know it, now they're doing this big, huge, meaningful thing. But it came out of those relationships, because in those relationships, you can have trust. And so in a place where a lot of people don't move, in a place where mostly everyone here grows up here, right? Trust as a cultural value is everything. And you can only build trust with, longevity, right? You can't build trust by talking to someone on the internet.
Yeah.
And so, if we really want to talk about the resiliency of movements to repression, right? And this is a place that has experienced a lot of that. Movements that are grounded in communities can survive.
Yeah.
Right. They're the ones that continue till today from the late 60s, because parents taught their kids who taught their kids about these things. Right. And now their kids are the ones in the streets at the anti-police protests. Like that world lives, and that's the world that we connect ourselves to. Right. We connect ourselves to that kind of politics, not this sort of abstract leftism.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to juxtapose it to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the tech, the internet, social media specifically, not the internet, social media really. I mean, it has good and bad. It can be leveraged to help form, aid international solidarity. But there is something to it as well, to where, like what you were saying before, it's widespread use, that a lot of the things that we were talking about like 25 minutes ago, you didn't see in a zine that was published in your hometown. Right. And it's because you knew the people who were publishing that zine in your hometown. And you had similar experiences, and you lived in a community. Right. And it was directly grounded in everything that you're saying. And that's, how I remember things, to be honest, when I was, actively engaged. And again, you don't have the option to get abstract,
Right.
The internet can do that, and it's you took that. Well, your Twitter is still up. I was going to leave this to the end, but I think it's maybe a little interesting sidetrack, but I struggle with this too, and but I won't put everyone through my inner turmoil, but when you talk about things like Twitter, right, or any social media, it's like, there's good that can come out of it, there's bad that can come out of it, right? And you all, you're still up, so there's like a archive, I guess you could say, of posts. But what informed the decision to say, we're not, at least on Twitter, we're not going to do this anymore?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with the same mentality that informed a project like Sleeper Surface, right? So we were talking about, like, who do we talk to on Twitter? And this isn't to say anything bad about like distros, right? Like, filler, love y'all. But that's who we were talking to. Like, we were talking to like distro projects, and like, and a lot of those projects we already knew people in and stuff like that. But what we weren't doing was talking to people locally at all, almost, right? And a lot of, I don't know if it's just here, a lot of people don't use Twitter here as like a primary communication mechanism. You only get a very small amount of characters. You can't really have like real discussions on it. And so we have defaulted to using Instagram, and it's mostly because of length and who we engage with. So most of the people that we engage with on Instagram are local, or they're people that are coming through interested in throwing events, and we can have actual conversations that we then move over to email with them, right? But there can be enough actual verbiage to get a sense of what's going on. So we have real conversations with people. But that's it. We have other social media accounts. We don't really use them. We fundraise through Open Collective, and that's like the closest to a really active account we have outside of Instagram. But the plan is not to change that, really. We might pop up something on, like, we have a collective account, might pop up something on Blue Sky as like an announcements thread or something like that, where we just write some bot to cross post between the services or something. But we don't have time for that. I mean, to really put it frankly, like, we do not have time to maintain 5 and 6 social media accounts, right? We barely have time to maintain one. And so again, we are capable of doing, right? To the degree that we're capable of doing it. And social media was not a priority to us. Because again, this isn't a project that's interested in like recruiting anarchists or something like that, right? Like we're not interested in like global geopolitics and those kinds of things. We talk about it, but that's not where our focus is. Like what we're engaged with is the fact that we live in one of the poorest, most violent cities in America,
Right.
and a city that's in deep conflict with its police department, and where a lot of different experiments are happening about how to live life differently, which capitalism failed 15 years ago. Like that's our reality,
Right.
And you hear a similar thing from like radicals in Detroit, right? Who will talk about this a lot too, but just I don't have time for like often petty abstract discussions, right?
Yeah.
We have to get an event together. We have to open up the space so the IWW can meet. We have to do X, Y, and Z. And the result of that has been not the creation of new movements, really, as much as bringing people that were already doing work into proximity with each other.
Yep.
We're having we're having these big events. Like we have this big event we call Make the Wasteland Blue, right? We did the first one earlier this year. We're doing another one in a month or so. And there are these kind of micro conferences that we do where we will invite organizers from all these groups, but not like traditional leftist groups. We're inviting community garden people. We're inviting people who do food distribution in their neighborhood. Like there are people who run their own books to prisons programs out of their houses, like stuff like because their friend is in prison or their cousin's in prison or stuff like that. These conferences focus on that kind of activity and getting those people working together, right? Because that's the basis of all of these autonomy experiments. That politics is really meaningful. That politics really matters, but it's entirely based in what we've been talking about. It's based on the ground, what's going on functionally on the ground, and very intentionally, I wouldn't say eschews abstraction, right? I mean, there's multiple writers in the Rhizome House group, right? We don't eschew abstraction, but we attempt as much as possible to use that as a way to inform other discussions, right? Not as a way to determine what we do. So, we might be able to say things like, we understand the damaging history and legacy of racism and colonialism in the United States. That's like a very abstract thing. But what does that mean here? Right? What does that look like? Where are spaces? What does that look like and how it's manifesting in our events? How does that manifest in the people showing up? And how are we going to impact that? Yeah. Right? We don't sit there and talk for half an hour about whether racism is real. Yeah. We don't have to have that conversation. Right? And so, we can depart from this really practical place. And I know myself, after having done this kind of work for a really long time, I really appreciate that. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what it's what we talked about how I kind of disappeared for a few years and came back, and when I came back, I was like, what the F is all this? But it's, to me, not very complicated. I mean, it's authentic coalition building, and in doing that, it's literally just working with your neighbors, and in your community, which is what I thought it was always about, and there's broader notions of an international community, sure, and that's true in solidarity, but it's, I would implore folks who this might be different, who there are folks who might not have experienced this or heard this before, that are listening, but if you are on social media and that's where you get a lot of your information, and some of these contrarian, I think of, when you're explaining that, someone like Jimmy Dore, for instance,
Jimmy Dore.
Well, we don't need to talk about him, but these ideas of how, oh no, you need to work with far right figures in coalition along class line, and it's objectively ridiculous, but juxtapose that garbage to like what you just heard, because this is the actual thing. And it's always been what you just said is just historically, traditionally, what that's looked like in real life, as juxtaposed to talking about abstract and rhetorical nonsense, some of the stuff that's said on those platforms by people like that. And then you might be able to understand why they're criticized, even if maybe there are some parts you believed or something, or 6 years ago, there were things that you might have liked about him, juxtapose the reality of doing to that abstract reality. Again, there's nothing wrong with abstraction. Sometimes we need that, but I think that concept might be able to hit home with some people at least.
Yeah, and it's again, it's not about doing away with abstraction. We can't,
Yeah.
right? All of thought is abstraction. But because all thought is abstraction, it also means that the things we think don't express the reality that we live.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to constantly recognize that gap, what Maurice Blunt's show called the unbridgeable chasm between the idea and the moment, right?
Right.
A lot of what we do departs from constant reminders of that, right? Just constantly sitting down and being like, okay, so we really want to do this. Here's where we're doing this. Here's the situation that we're doing this in. What can we do? Right.
It's what we can do. I feel like there's such a legitimate, varying on this on a large spectrum of, what this actually means, from an opinion to people who are very well informed on it. But there does seem to be, as for all the reasons you stated about the trajectory of, this country, people that do want to look for some type of, they wouldn't say solidarity, I don't think, but maybe a more populist language of like, well, we're in this, like it's us and we're getting screwed. And I do think there's this broader, idea of that. And it leaves open opportunities for opportunistic people to take advantage of it, of course. But I feel like what you're explaining helps resolve that.
I mean,
like this is the solution to that.
The Zapatistas talked about this. I mean, like this is how they organized early on. It was just like in towns, person to person, right?
Yeah.
The labor movement in the United States was organized in bars and living rooms. It wasn't organized in union halls. The union halls came later.
Right.
We really look at the end of the Civil War and the way that slaves engaging in strike activity was really instrumental in ending the Civil War. I mean, these are all autonomous, decentralized forms of activity that have had incredible impacts that live down till today. So like someone like me, my parents weren't union, but everyone else in my family was, right? And like my parents were super pro-union. And so you grow up with the idea that unions are what allows you to retire and what allows you to fight with your boss, right? That idea comes from the early 20th century. And yet someone like me who was a kid in the 80s and 90s was getting raised with that, right? That is how these ideas live, is they live through these kind of imperceptible lines of diffusion, right? But we have to have those connections for those lines to exist,
right?
And it's why, I think you see this kind of really grounded politics a lot in like Rust Belt cities, again, because those connections often already exist. You already know the people that are in your neighborhood. You already know the people that you're organizing with, right? The IRA used to talk about how that was the root of their success in Northern Ireland.
It's true.
All of their cells were based on childhood friendships, right? A lot of them.
It's true. It just anecdotally, I grew up in an area that was not the Rust Belt, but I had a lot of family in Western Pennsylvania, by the Ohio border, and they did. And it was interesting because a lot of the things that you're talking about are things that, I kind of absorbed just as a child, going and visiting people there and then going home and seeing how kids were at the school I was at. I mean, not, certainly some privileged top percent or anything like that, but just the history and the experience, were divergent for sure, different.
Yeah. And so that builds things like grounding politics in local culture, for example. Because we're just an expression of that, right? And so, one of my friends, Aragorn, who helped start Little Black Cart, before he died, one of the things he talked a lot about was the concept of home. And the concept of home not necessarily being where you're from, but where you find solace, right? Like where you find a place to depart from, like where your point of departure is, and how important the idea of home had gotten for him as he got older, right? And I definitely have experienced that myself. I moved home after having been gone for some years to go to graduate school and things, and immediately moved back into something that felt very familiar, right? And so a lot of what happens at the Rhizome House is heavily grounded in the fact that we're here. All of us are here. We're not transplants. Like There are people that move here sometimes, but people that form the core of that group by and large are not transplants, right? Now, you juxtapose that to a place like San Francisco or even Pittsburgh sometimes, or New York, right?
Yep.
Where a combination of the tech economy and gentrification has created a situation in which almost nobody's a local anymore, right? And that not only has this effect of kind of abstracting politics, right? It kind of removes politics from its space because nobody knows what the space is anymore, but it sort of premises politics on that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see, and I've lived in cities like that, so where the politics exist, but they exist within their own ecosystems,
Yes.
because there isn't that overarching, and there might be, it all depends. There might be on blocks, or neighborhoods, but generally speaking, you don't have that overarching community connection, historical community connection. Yeah.
And you can see the distinction, say, in the George Floyd uprising, right? Like, who were the people that were out in the streets? Who were the people that were getting arrested? They were not people that were part of traditional leftist organizations at all. Right? There are people from neighborhoods, there are people from streets, there are people who experience police brutality directly, right? That's definitely who made up the 5,000 people that showed up here when everything hit the fan on May 30th, right? That wasn't being done. I mean, sure, there are plenty of radicals down there, but that was not who the primary protagonists of that situation were, right? And that mirrored itself all over the country. That in itself should tell radicals everything they need to know.
Right.
Not only did we miss potentially the biggest uprising in modern American history, we were even protagonists in it, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we might have helped organize a couple protests here and there, but we were participants just like everybody else. And that's actually the reality of uprisings, is that revolutionaries don't make them. They're not made in reading groups and theory circles, although those things are fun and fine and great, and I love them. But what we call revolts, are what happens when the distinction between people that are political and people that don't identify that way breaks down, right? It's when all of a sudden the political space bursts out into the open in this really acute way and starts to spread itself across space, right? That's what a revolt is. It is definitely not about parties and organizations. It is absolutely about people and circumstance, right? And so it's always grounded where we are. And if we're going to engage in that kind of politics, it seems sort of absurd to not depart from that position, right?
Yeah. And it's true in expressions. I mean, revolt, it's a whole other thing. But I mean, revolts are very much an expression, of instantaneous outrage and autonomy, and everything that we talked about. But even with what you're saying about organizing within community, there's still a connection to that, to understanding that type of direct action and facilitating and being part of a broader group of people who don't necessarily, community gardeners, for instance, that have nothing in common with an alternative recovery group, that might not have anything in common with people that come and cook and, do things like, food not bombs or whatever. That builds that community. And I don't think you can like separate community and coalition, and maybe that's what I'm getting at in this kind of critique, because when you look at the idea of coalition building gone wrong, it's everything that you just said. It gets abstracted to politics and organizations and political parties, but it's also how you can get to the place to where you get into this populist rhetoric of saying, I'll work with these folks, they're a little racist or whatever, but we're all poor. It's how you work your way into bad situations. And there's a lot of people that take advantage of that.
And so it's in a lot of ways about simplifying things. Think about a community of friends. If someone's a jerk, what happens? People stop hanging out with them. It's really not that complicated, right? And so like, in a situation in which you're serving food and someone's being a racist jackass, you don't have to give them food. Like, it's not that hard, right? It's not something that needs to be abstracted that far. These are like basic questions of interpersonal dynamics, right? These are not huge theory questions about how we approach the international proletariat. This is about like whether we serve food to the guy who's like probably having some problems and spouting off a bunch of stuff that's not great, right? And that's a decision you got to make right there, right then, because you might want to give the guy some food just to get him to go away. Like these are real decisions that you have to make. One of the things that we talk a lot about here is that some of the people in town that do the most real work are Catholic workers. And there's a significant part of the anarchist community here that is Catholic workers. And they've been active here since the dawn of the Catholic worker movement. And they want to talk about people that really do the work. On the ground every day, serving food, living in collective houses with people that are unhoused. Like they're going down doing encampments, they're doing everything. I mean, it's really impressive. And you know what? You almost never hear about them engaging in these kind of abstract debates because they're way too busy keeping their storefront going.
It's the reality of it, and it's like what and it applies to what you were just saying. It applies to Ukraine. It applies, it's that reality point. I can say the same thing about just direct aid for immigrants seeking asylum. Some of the organizations that are doing the most in that are organizations that you might read their statement and say, that one paragraph, I don't know about that. But those are people that are doing the work. Those are people that have people held up in hotels. They're bringing them food every day in packages. They're making sure women have, hygiene products and that kids have formula and basic stuff like that. And that's where, I think it's a good indicator if you're talking about, little red flags or bells in your head. When people start talking about things that just on their facing, like, hon, we're talking about working with this group or that group. Like, maybe ask, are these people doing the thing that they're talking about?
Right.
Right. Because that's where it gets at, when it becomes a media person or a thought leader or an academic even, and they're not actually engaging in what it is that they're talking about. That's also how things can kind of get abstract too. Sometimes it's benevolent, but sometimes it's not,
Yeah. You saw that the anti-war movement was a classic example of coalition building gone wrong, right? Like it was this kind of situation in which bourgeois liberals were able to sort of take control of the entire movement by taking over steering committees because coalition in the anti-war movement was sort of deterministic of what you were able to do, right? It became more about building singular organization than actual coalition, right? Or like we refer to it here as networking, right? So because what we're doing is we're sort of creating connections between nodes without trying to form them into one thing. Right. This is all about us all fighting our fight.
It can devolve into, very, not necessarily evil, bad stuff, but it devolves into stuff that you see elsewhere in the world that's just not great.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes a question of us fighting our fights together, right? No one's fighting for anybody else, right? Because representation in that context is deeply problematic. But instead, we're all fighting for our own reasons. And all these groups have their own things they're engaged in. And it's that difference that creates the vibrancy. Right. Like there's nothing in the project of the Rhizome House that is trying to like get everyone to be like, black shirt wearing circle anarchists like we all are. If people want to do that, great, sure, fine. But really, I'm a lot more interested in like how we're going to abolish the police.
Well, yeah. Again, it's what are we doing? And that applies to so much. I think before we were talking about anti-imperialism, I think, and kind of like atrocity denial, but this idea of, you can make these statements and then defend them and argument and make a career, doing so, right? But then, like, what is it that you're doing, right? Are you helping the people that you're writing about, or are you staking a claim for speaking and books and your, public image? And it's the same with like, we're all going to be anarchists here. We're wearing black. We got the A, and it's like, well, what are you doing? Are you starting like a group so that people can wear the same clothes, or are you starting a group that's actually going to do something? And it's the same thing, again, we talk, things can be complicated, but they can also be simple, and it's, again, what are you doing?
We saw this beautiful expression of that at Cooper's memorial, in fact.
I'm sure.
I gave a eulogy at Cooper's memorial, which didn't hold back at all. I mean, it was very overtly about the importance of the internationalist resistance and why that would be a thing that he would feel compelled towards, and how that's a thing we all have to be a part of. But at that memorial, there were like dozens of people from the Ukrainian community came, right? All these Eagle Scouts showed up. We had guys from, ex-Marines, like Marine veterans showing up, right? And you want to talk about communities of people that might not normally have a lot in common, right? But there, then in that moment, right, at that point, all 400 people sang Bella Ciao together.
Yeah. Yeah. This is real life. Yeah.
You know, that's real life in a church of all things, right? And so this kind of juxtaposition of like what an ideological anarchist position would be in that situation, which is like, screw churches, we're going to mourn on our own, we don't need national associations, all this stuff, versus this recognition that in this moment, for right now, all of us can respect one another for this moment as people, as individual people, right?
Because it's about the moment.
And there's an understanding there, right? Cooper sacrificed himself for this, right? People in the military view what they're doing as that. People that are from Ukraine are viewing what their family is doing as that. But in all of these contexts, what all these people were able to connect on is the idea that all of them were motivated to do something incredibly dangerous because of what they thought was the best thing for, you know, themselves and for their communities, right? Whether I might think people in the military making that calculation are wrong or not, that is the calculation making a lot of the time. And so, but the connections that we could build from that, right? The relationships we built in that situation, you know, it helped, I think, a lot of us, not just in the anarchist community, but I think in general, it helped a lot of us heal to know that like,
sure,
we could show up and like 100 people from the Ukrainian community showed up at our friend's funeral, you know, and our friend was fighting for an anarchist unit and they all knew that and they showed up anyways. You know, that's real. Those people were declaring solidarity with us in that moment.
Right.
Even if we agree on very little else.
Right. Right. And again,
you know, community, it's not about uniformity, right?
Yeah.
It's about how difference interfaces with itself and interfaces with each other.
I feel like there's a lot of people that are searching for that, but they're looking for answers, like what you said, and the easiest answers aren't the correct ones necessarily.
Right.
The safer answers aren't the correct ones either. It's safer to stay in your house and listen and read, and you know, but the reality will bring that to you. It's not something you need to look for. It's just you need to engage with the world around you. Yeah. And I mean, what you just said is a great example, you know.
Yeah.
But
well, and it's, you know, like I talk to people in Ukraine all the time. You know, there's been this solidarity that's built up between my crew of people and like solidarity collectives people in Kyiv. You know, it's like these, but why does that connection exist?
Right.
You know, it's because there's something going on here that we are all complicit in now.
Yeah.
Right. And we are bound up in this. Like we are bound up in this struggle, just like they are from a much further distance than they are, but we are bound up in this struggle. And that simple act of solidarity means everything in both directions.
So with that, right? So with working like with solidarity collectives, I'm going to work on something about them actually, but what about at home? So what are things that the Rhizome House, you know, has coming up? Or if you want to talk about what we did with their tornado recently, or just what are some things that are kind of happening now over there?
Yeah, so I mean, we do all kinds of stuff on a kind of regular basis. We have anarchist reading groups every other week. We have movie showings once a month. We one of my favorite things is we do a big giant open community potluck the last Tuesday of every month, and people just kind of bring in all kinds of food, and like all these people show up, and there's no purpose for the event except just being in the space and just hanging out, right? You know, we have a report back from a trip to Chiapas that another group is doing soon. I think actually today. We have a organization called Thrive for Change, which is this absolutely incredible grassroots, non-abstinence based sort of organization that kind of helps people that are struggling with addiction. And they have, you know, discussion groups at our space, because our space is a giant abolish police banner in the front of it, and people know that they can be safe there, right? Something as simple as that. But we have poetry readings, we have all these things, and really a lot of what we're trying to do is turn what we're doing into just a part of lives, right? It's not this special, unique space called politics. It's like you're just going to the community center down the street. The whole point is to sort of construct this open space, right? I mean, not even all the people that do events at the space are anarchists, right? Like, we definitely have had like liberal groups meeting up there and stuff like that. And, we tend to have certain rules about like not being authoritarians and stuff, but, generally it's a pretty open format. And so the goal ultimately of the project is to grow these kind of consistent things, reading groups, movie showings, things that are very consistent, happen all the time and just sort of automatically happen, that can kind of form a foundation to build on top of, right? We do this also, like every year, Rhizome House is involved in throwing the New Year's Eve jail demo downtown. Like, we throw this big noise demonstration at the jail on New Year's Eve where people like pound on like, pots and pans, and all the prisoners pound on the windows and the guards get real mad at us. And, we do that, but that's part of trying to establish tradition.
Yeah.
Right. That every New Year's, we're just going to do that, whether a group calls for it or not. We're all just going to show up 7 o'clock. We're going to make a bunch of noise, right? Everyone's going to go off to their parties at 9 and it's going to be great. And everyone, but a lot of this is about establishing that, because I think one of the things that we talk a lot about at the Rhizome House internally is the notion of intergenerational anarchism, right? Like, you look at Catalonia, right? For anyone that's ever been there, and you walk down the streets and you see like C&T flags flying off people's like balconies and stuff. And it's not because there's like tons of like punks. It's because the like 65-year-old person who lives in that apartment's just been a C&T member since they were like 17, and it's just very much a part of their life. I went to a benefit show at a squat in Valencia one time. And there were people, and this was a punk show, like a loud one. And there were people ranging from like 14 to 80 years old at this thing, right? That longevity allows us to have patience. It allows us to understand the spaces that we're operating in. It allows us to ground our activity, right? And a lot of that is built on our ability to have these things that can persist and can be resilient. Not stable, not the same, but things that can sort of have a life, right? And be these constantly shifting organic entities, right? And the Rhizome House is that. I mean, it's in the very name. Like, we are very much trying to create the space of encounter. We're trying to sort of create political conditions in the city that are conducive for the kind of politics that we have. But it's also about what that means for us is bringing all of these people together to fight for autonomy on their own, right? But in communication with each other. That's really the primary goal. And so, what we're trying to do is build the foundation for there to be, I mean, there are many kids in the community already, right? I've got kids, there's many other kids in the community, but there's gonna be grandkids soon, right? And there's gonna be great grandkids. And that longevity, that ability to pass those lessons down generation, that's why I'm here, right? That's why a lot of the people that showed up on May 30th are there, right? Not because they were engaged in traditional leftist organizing, but because they came from social and familial circumstances in which those kinds of ethics are taught, right? In which you learn your history, in which you understand the role of political struggle in what you have, right? Keeping those stories alive, building our lives on that, building our narratives on that, that storytelling is incredibly important. And that takes longevity, right? And so anarchists in America kind of sucked at that generally, right? We move around a lot. I mean, I think probably like people don't travel as much as we used to. Like, we used to all travel constantly, but move around a lot and stuff like that. And there's not a lot of rooting down places, but we really need to start to understand what it means to find home, essentially, and to build around that idea of home. The place that we're going to be, the place that we're going to dedicate ourselves to, or like the way that some of us talk about the place where we draw our line in the sand and say it's not going to go any further. Like, this is the place that we're defending, right? And that's how we see what we're doing a lot of the time. This is a city that, as a city, as a population is in a fight with global capitalism every day, every single day. And we just choose to be a part of that already existing struggle. We don't see ourselves as creating revolution or being special. We just see ourselves as other residents of the city who got together to do a thing just like many other groups of people do. And we happen to have our motivations just like the Jehovah's Witnesses down the street or whatever. It's about encouraging autonomous collective horizontal organizing as a way to reimagine, not even reimagine how we live, how to mobilize structures that are already present in many communities, right? So structures of mutual aid and collective self-defense.
Right. So I'm going to put the email as well as the email list link in the description. There's an Instagram account. There's the Twitter's up there. It's just, you know, not active. But if folks are maybe in the region, you know, I don't know, maybe they're going for a road trip and they're coming through Ohio. What's the best way to find you all? Is it going on the website and reading about things there, or
So what we tell everyone to do, well, what we tell everyone is we're open when there's an event. So if there's not an event, we're not open, right? So if you try and come when there's nothing there, there's not going to be anyone there to let you in. And that has happened a few times, which is why I'm mentioning this, right? Some people have traveled in without telling us and ended up staring at a dark storefront.
I've done that before. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I used to do that back
but,
in the day.
Yeah.
Back in the day, all the time before smartphones, when you would hitchhike into a town, that was the norm. You know, just showing up at the empty info shop. But yeah, so we don't, you know, we're not open when there's not something there. We do print a calendar. So like we primarily rely on, you know, printed outreach a lot of the time. And so we print calendars at the beginning of the month and we get people to put them out all over town. Pretty much within a week, those calendars are more or less obsolete because we're adding stuff all the time. So what I tell people is grab a calendar. It's a good basis to know what the consistent events that are going on that month are, but like check the schedule online because there's stuff getting added there all the time. We're probably open 4 or 5 days a week now at this point. So if people really just want to drop in, Sundays from 1 to 4, we have what are called crafternoon, which really is like people come and craft, some people knit, some people read, some people write, a lot of Rhizome House people are cleaning, you know, stuff like that. But it's just this kind of way to come to the space and sort of be there together, right? As well as a place for people to drop in to get information if they want to. So Sundays are a good time to come.
All right. Awesome, Tom. Thanks for taking the time to talk. I know we talked a lot before, probably talk a lot after too, but I appreciate you being willing to talk about your personal experiences and everything with Cooper, but also all the great stuff at the Rhizome House and what that means, I mean, globally, you know, as well as community.
Yeah, we're this will be interesting. I'll make sure to let you know when we do this, but where the back of the Rhizome House is getting redone now to be the Cooper Andrews Center for Resistance and Autonomy.
Wow.
And that's what some of the Memorial Fund money is going for.
Awesome.
Is to build that. And Anton from the Solidarity Collectives is going to do the opening talk.
Is that the same one? Let me ask. So is that the same fundraiser as the GoFundMe from his mother?
Yeah. That's the fund.
Okay, I'll put that up too.
Yeah. We have it getting fiscally sponsored, managed by a church and stuff. And so like actually the church we did the memorial at. So it's all set up. So we're building that. Anton's going to do the opening talk, obviously remotely from Kyiv, but or Kharkiv, depending on where he's at that day. But yeah, I'll make sure to let you know. We're going to stream the talk because it's going to be coming over the internet.
Yeah, for sure. Let me know. I'll blast it as best I can. I'll watch it myself.
Yeah. This situation has had a really profound effect on people here.
Yeah, sure.
And Cooper's not the only person our community has lost. Even in the last year, we've lost 4 people in the last year. 3 to suicide and 1 to Russian imperialism. And this community consistently experiences loss. right? It's a place where people consistently experience loss. But this one was different.
Yeah.
This one is creating this sense in which a lot of people are like, well, if Cooper's willing to do that, then we better focus. We got some shit to get done. We got to actually like get our lives together. There are people I know that are like working on their mental health so they can be in a better place to like do politics better. There's people I know that are working on their sleep schedules and eating, um, because they want to be in a better place to carry that mission forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
It's important. It's, not to carry on, but that might be a good place to end. Someone like Cooper, um, gave everything he could, of course, but you know, when you're engaged in things like the Rhizome House or mutual aid or a group, it is important to focus on yourself too, because like you said, you want to keep
yes.
these things happening and you want this to be generational, and burnout is a very real thing. I've seen it happen a lot, and I've done that to myself too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what ends up happening is you end up failing the people that you're trying to help because you just can't sustain what it is that you're doing.
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
self-care is important.
yeah. Especially in environments like this, where things are hard. I mean, like hard all the time, for people. It can really eat you up, and um, so the idea always, and this is an idea Cooper was very attached to, but just the notion that we've already been fighting capitalism in the city for 100 years, and we're going to do it more longer, right? And so if I don't get that, food picked up today because I don't want to burn myself out, as opposed to talking about some random theory question, but just because I need to take care of myself, that's fine. And everyone's cool with that. And there's like this big culture of self-care in the radical community here because of that, which I think is really cool. I think a lot of it, again, is because a lot of us are older. A lot of us have experienced burnout before. And so we're just like, yeah, sometimes we need to rest. Sometimes I need to plan a couple weeks ahead to go out to the woods for a week in a place where no one can contact me, like things like that. I think a lot of that comes from experiencing loss and going through tragedy together. And I mean, it's a community of people that's tighter than any other radical community I've ever seen because of that.
That's awesome, Tom. All right, thanks again for coming on and speaking with me.
Yeah, of course, man. Absolutely. I'd be happy to do it again anytime.
Okay.